This is Revelation 16, the vials of wrath poured out, part 2, and in this part I am going to commence a look at the first vial of wrath, but before I do, I will again pick up on the first part, which we've just looked at, and remind you of where we are now at in the prophetic timeline. Now, I want to get back on track. I started out reviewing the point in time that the prophecy was directing our attention to, but then I went on and discussed the fact that only the infidel school and Christian philosopher were the only two classes of people who were awake enough to see that France was about to explode. And then I went on and talked about the natural catastrophes that were also abounding at this point as a portent of what was about to occur. So moving on, let's remember that the point in the prophetic timeline, the point in history we have now reached, is that where there is the passing of the power of the second woe, that is, the end of the threat of the Ottoman Empire, and that this was reached in the late 1700s. And now, behold, the third woe cometh quickly. So, right now, we are at the point near the end of the 1700s, and we are anticipating something new in terms of the dreadful judgments of God, the vials of wrath being poured out, as anticipated in the preceding chapters of Revelation 14 and 15. Now we go to Revelation 16, verse 1. And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the seven angels, Go your ways, and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. And the first went, and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. The events that began on the 14th of July 1789, when a French mob stormed and seized control of the Bastille, a medieval fortress, armory and political prison in the centre of Paris, which represented royal authority and tyranny, opened a new and important chapter in world history, for it began the French Revolution and brought about the beginning of the fulfillment of what we have just read in Revelation 16 verses 1 to 2, and that is the pouring out of the first of the seven last vials of wrath upon the earth. From History.com we read the following concerning this infamous event in world history. It says, Parisian revolutionaries and mutinous troops storm and dismantle the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison that had come to symbolize the tyranny of the Bourbon monarchs. This dramatic action signaled the beginning of the French Revolution, a decade of political turmoil and terror in which King Louis XVI was overthrown and tens of thousands of people, including the king and his wife Marie Antoinette, were executed. Within just a few months of the start of this momentous event, the two great pillars of France, number one, an absolute monarchy wed together with, number two, the powerful and hierarchical Roman Catholic Church, were thrown down to the ground amidst terrible bloodshed, massacre and destruction. Immorality and lawlessness ran unrestrained, while tens of thousands of people were murdered. France was known as the eldest daughter of the Church of Rome, the most Catholic of all the Catholic nations, and just prior to this, in the 17th and 18th centuries, they had slaughtered or exiled every Protestant in their nation. But now, during the French Revolution, there was a complete change. Within 5 years, some 2 million people had died, including 24,000 priests who had been murdered and 40,000 church buildings that were turned into stables. This was one of several great epochs in world history that was foreordained by God so long ago, and it unleashed a demonic revolutionary spirit into the world that is still with us to this very day. This revolutionary spirit was not to confine itself to France only, but was to spill over into the rest of the world, and it gave rise to socialism, communism, liberalism, and more, and these things have been a tremendous plague in the world. Under communism, untold tens of millions, perhaps even in excess of 200 millions of people have suffered and died. This evil spirit is openly manifesting itself today in the United States and the rest of the world, and is now found under such names as critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, the teaching of gender fluidity, and so on. All these things are working with their agents to overthrow and destroy a once Christian-based Western culture. From the left-leaning Wikipedia, we read this under an article about irreligion in France. It says, "The French Revolution marked a turning point for the ascendancy of atheism to a preeminent position as a cognitive and cultural stance against papal supremacy and the Holy Roman Empire across Europe and throughout the world." And so there we can see the origins of modern atheism in the world. It came out of the French Revolution. This article goes on, now known as the atheist cult of reason ideology, established by Jacques Hebert, Pierre Gaspard Chaumette, and their supporters, and intended as a replacement for Christianity, and was replete with ceremonious destruction of Christian relics, conversion of churches into temples of reason, and the personification of reason as a goddess. Obviously, this article is talking about Roman Catholicism when it talks about Christianity. True Christianity has no relics. Perhaps maybe the old people in the back row, if I can be funny, but look, truly Christianity has no relics, and also the people are the church, not any building, no matter how grand it may be. I want to be clear, the people are the church, at least 2 or 3 gathered in his name, there am I in the midst of them, and a building is simply not a church. Now note also in this article there is no mention at all about the multitudes that were butchered and murdered at this time. And when you are leaning to the left, as Wikipedia does, and it wants to talk about something that is appealing to them, like atheism, then the lives of people are inconsequential. Now, the revolt against papal supremacy and the Holy Roman Empire is not the problem here, but rather it is the rise of atheism, because atheism is not only a rejection of Romanism, but it is also a rejection of true Christianity. When the people revolted, for the most part, the religion of the Church of Rome was the only religion they had ever known. This is what was portrayed to them as biblical Christianity, and of course they hated it. And so atheism, human reason, seemed to be a viable alternative. So not only did they throw out Roman Catholicism, but in replacing it with human reason, replacing it with atheism, they also rejected biblical Christianity. And here is just one more aspect of the enormous damage caused by the Church of Rome down through the ages. When the people finally had enough of it, they threw the true gospel of Jesus Christ out the window with it. And this is most unfortunate. And concerning this aspect, we read in the 1823 Encyclopaedia Britannica under the subheading Causes of the Revolution the following. The established religion of France had for some time past been gradually undermined. It had been solemnly assaulted by philosophers in various elaborate performances, and men of wit, among whom Voltaire took the lead, had attacked it with the dangerous weapon of ridicule. The Roman Catholic religion is much exposed in this respect, in consequence of the multitude of false miracles and legendary tales with which its history abounds, without discriminating betwixt the respectable principles on which it rests, and the superstitious follies by which they had been defaced. The French nation learned to laugh at the whole, and rejected instead of reforming the religion of their fathers. Eliot writes in the Horae Apocalypticae, Volume 3, "It was a convulsion of internal origin, and not Like the great judgments previously inflicted on Christendom, one that arose out of the eruption of external invading foes from the four winds. It was a convulsion in which the exasperated passions of men manifested themselves with a virulence unprecedented in the world's history against both Christ's religion, God's judgments, and their fellow men, according to the statement, quote, "The nations were angry," end quote. That we are dealing with one of the most momentous events in world history is clear from the following quote from Sir Archibald Alison, taken from his book History of Europe from the commencement of the French Revolution in 1789 to the restoration of the Bourbons in 1815, Volume 1, where it says this in the introduction. There is no period in the history of the world which can be compared, in point of interest and importance, to that which embraces the progress and termination of the French Revolution. In no former age were events of such magnitude crowded together, or interests so momentous at issue between contending nations. From the flame which was kindled in Europe, the whole world has been involved in conflagration, and a new era has dawned upon both hemispheres from the effects of its extension. Alison talks about events of such magnitude crowded together, and what we are going to go on and see as we progress through the first 5 vials is that this is exactly what was anticipated in the prophecy, major events overlapping one on top of another as the vials are poured out. And then over a page or two we read this. Effects so various could not have arisen in the ordinary course of human events. The talent developed was too great, the wickedness committed too appalling, to be explained on the usual principles of human nature. It seemed rather as if some higher powers had been engaged in a strife in which man was the visible instrument, as if the demons of hell had been let loose to scourge mankind, and the protection of heaven for a time withdrawn from virtue, to subject its firmness to the severest test. The fancy of antiquity would have peopled the scene with hostile deities, supporting unseen the contest of armies. The severer genius of Christianity beheld in it the visible interposition of almighty power to punish the sins of a corrupted world. In the book, The Powers of Europe and the Fall of Sebastopol, which is written by a British officer, sums up the outcome of the beginning of the French Revolution and the events that quickly followed, and it records the situation 3 years later and says, "At length, on the 20th of April 1792, oppressed with the solemnity and grandeur of the occasion, the declaration of war against Austria was received by the National Assembly of France in solemn silence. Thus commenced the greatest, the most bloody, and the most interesting war which has agitated mankind since the fall of the Roman Empire. Rising from feeble beginnings, it at length involved the world in its conflagration. Rousing the passions of every class, it brought unheard of armies into the field, and it was carried on with a degree of exasperation unknown in modern times. Quote, a revolution in France, end quote, says Napoleon, quote, is always followed sooner or later by a revolution in Europe, end quote. As the scripture has declared, the events that commenced with the start of the French Revolution were the judgments of God upon the men which had the mark of the beast and upon them which worshipped his image. And this is why the impact of the French Revolution quickly spread to other Catholic-dominated countries, and why Protestant England was spared these dreadful events. And if you recall, I touched upon this aspect when we looked at Revelation chapter 15. This was the time period when the papacy lost its temporal ruling power, and with it went much of its persecuting power, from which it has not recovered. The papal system has yet to be ultimately driven totally off the scene, and we're going to talk more about this much later when we delve deeper into this chapter and bring the whole thing into our present day and age. It should be of the utmost interest to any student of Bible prophecy that the outbreak of tremendous change in papal Europe had been anticipated by historicists over 100 years before it occurred. Even though France was regarded as the most Christian, so-called, meaning the most Catholic of the 10 papal kingdoms, it was understood by many historicists to be the place most likely to erupt against the papacy, and furthermore, historicists were also able to anticipate when this would occur. Now, how was it that historicists were able to correctly anticipate this? Well, they had some very basic and fundamental understanding of Bible prophecy, which is basically totally missing from those who teach Bible prophecy today. By following the pattern of what had already unfolded in the book of Revelation and in history, that is, following the sequence of events starting with the 7 seals and then the trumpets, and also understanding that a day spoken of in Bible prophecy is meant to be understood as a year in our time, they were able to anticipate the next events that were to follow in the career of the Fourth World Empire, or pagan Rome as it became known. I am going to add that even those that follow the Roman Catholic doctrines of futurism and preterism both understand the day for a year principle. However, when it comes to the prophetic time measurements found in Daniel and the Revelation, namely a time times in half a time, 1,260 days and 42 months, among others, without any scriptural authority whatsoever, they throw this understanding right out of the window and boldly proclaim that these prophetic time measurements can only be understood as a day for a day, and that a period like a time times and a half, 42 months, or 1,260 days simply equates to a literal 3.5 years. In doing this, the adherents to both futurism and preterism have the wrong foundation, the wrong key to the lock, and thus the prophecy remains closed to them, and they must therefore speculate and twist things to make it all fall into line with this Roman Catholic approach to the prophecy that they have adopted. If you recall, we have already previously discussed this day for a year principle. You will find it in the parts on Revelation chapter 9 under both the 5th and 6th trumpets. You'll find it also in Revelation 11, and again you will find the matter explored in depth in my series called An Examination of Preterism and Other Things, and that series especially will likely answer any objections that a person might have to this biblical principle. At least I hope it does. A massive amount of work has gone into all of that, and it will save you a vast amount of time, so please, if you're unsure about this part of it, please check those parts out for your edification. In Revelation 11, Part 2, we considered 3 key opening or commencement periods in the career of the papacy, and specifically in relation to the matter to hand. There we saw that temporal or political authority was conferred upon the papacy in the period AD 529 to AD 533, when the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian published an edict which acknowledged the Pope to be the head of the churches and that all must be subject to the Bishop of Rome. This conferred on the Pope a title belonging only to the Saviour, and also placed the empire and all of its people under the dominion of the Bishop of Rome. Now note that this was conferred upon the Pope by the Eastern Roman Emperor, whereas back in the West it was the Pope who was there acting in the capacity of the Emperor in the West, for he had quite comfortably stepped into the shoes and the position formerly held by the Caesars of old. The period, which began in AD 529, saw all the former legislation and laws of the Roman Empire nullified, and a new legal system was introduced, and this whole process ended in AD 533. The entire legal system was completely overhauled, and running concurrently with this was the fact that the Emperor Justinian codified the Pope's temporal and ecclesiastical power through his decree of papal supremacy, and this is what makes this period so noteworthy. Counting forward 1,260 years, that is, on a day for a year principle, understanding that the time, times, and half a time, the 42 months, and the 1,260 days are in fact meant to be understood as years, counting forward 1,260 years from this most noteworthy period in relation to the acquisition of temporal power by the papacy, we arrive at the period 1789 to 1793, the time of the French Revolution, as we have already noted. This period was extremely destructive for the power of the papacy and was a major turning point in world history, as has already been noted. The French Revolution gave birth to Napoleon, and that in turn helped spread the contagion throughout the other Catholic nations of Europe, and this in turn, of course, further weakened the power of the papacy, and I'm going to be looking at this in further detail as we continue through chapter 16. So based on what we have just considered, this basic understanding of Bible prophecy, here is a list of some of many historicists that were able to predict the French Revolution and the loss of papal power long before it took place. Of course, they weren't calling it the French Revolution at the time of their writings, but they knew 1789 to 1793 was a critical terminal date in Bible prophecy in connection with the Fourth World Empire, Papal Rome, and furthermore, many pointed to the place, France, as being the likely place where the trouble would all start, and they were right. In 1644 there was Thomas Brightman, 1660 James Durham, 1663 Joseph Meade, 1680 Henry Moore, 1683 Thomas Goodwin, 1685 Jacques Philpot, 1689 Peter Giraud, 1701 Robert Fleming, 1745 Moses Lohman, 1748 Bishop Thomas Newton, and there are others. And here are a couple of examples. Way back in 1689, Peter Giraud, a French Protestant pastor at Rotterdam in the Netherlands, wrote in his book, The Accomplishment of the Prophecies of Scripture, the following: Who must begin this last revolt? 'Tis most probable that France shall, not Spain, which, as yet, is plunged in superstition, and is as much under the tyranny of the clergy as ever. It cannot be any country but France, which a long time ago hath begun to shake off the yoke of Rome. Over a few more pages, Peter Giraud says, The kings of France at this day do lift their authority so high that nothing can resist it. 'Tis therefore probable that everything will bend under the yoke of their will when they shall resolve to break with Rome. A full century before the French Revolution, Jacques Philpot, who wrote Elucidations on the Apocalypse of St. John, published in 1687, said this: As the King of France did his utmost to enhance the glory of popery, it will be the King of France who shall most contribute to her ruin. Jacques Philpot finished his manuscript in August 1685, just 2 days before the arrival of the dragoons who destroyed his home, and only the manuscript of his work was saved. After having reached a port of safety, he compared this with the writings of Peter Giraud, and was delighted to find virtual agreement. In Robert Carangola's book, The Present Reign of Jesus Christ, he speaks of Robert Fleming and says this: The historicist Fleming wrote 2 vital works. They are called The Apocalyptic Key and The Rise and Fall of the Papacy. Both works were published in the first decade of the 18th century. These works were written almost 100 years before the French Revolution. He showed his findings to King William III, who was then the Protestant King of Great Britain. It was William III who deposed James II, who was trying to bring the Roman Catholic religion back to England and make it the state religion. This was Prince William of Orange, who was then crowned King William III. Fleming showed his findings to King William III around the year 1690. In his writings, he looked at the date AD 533 and said that exactly 1,260 years later, we would expect to see God pouring out his vials of judgment upon the Latin kingdom of Europe. He said it must begin in the year 1793 to 94. He went further and said that if the judgments didn't start in Italy, they would start in France, the eldest daughter of the papacy, and that was absolutely precise. In 1758, Bishop Thomas Newton said in his book Dissertations on the Prophecies this: Rome therefore will finally be destroyed by some of the princes who are reformed or shall be reformed from popery, and as the kings of France have contributed greatly to her advancement, it is not impossible nor improbable that some time or other they may also be the principal authors of her destruction. France hath already shown some tendency towards a reformation, and therefore may appear more likely to accomplish it. And before I leave this part, I have included the start of the following timeline for the vials of wrath as a visual aid. The first vial opens with the French Revolution era starting in 1789, as we have seen, and I'm going to add to this as we proceed further. This is the end of Revelation 16, the vials of wrath poured out, part 2.